What if a dream of flying high became the greatest challenge of a child's life? A solo flight, meant to be the beginning of independence and freedom, suddenly turns into a journey full of hurt and injustice. Yet sometimes, it's the unexpected hardships that become the perfect opportunity to prove courage and ignite change. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you inspiring stories filled with bravery, hope, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Let's begin this special journey. Elijah Brown, a 12-year-old boy living in Atlanta, Georgia, is a bright student with sparkling eyes and a radiant smile. Elijah is intelligent, eager to learn, and has a unique passion for airplanes that began when he was very young. He spends hours reading books about different types of planes, studying how they work, and dreaming of one day becoming a pilot or an aerospace engineer. During his end-of-year school exams, Elijah achieved outstanding scores, especially in math and science, making his entire family proud. But Elijah's biggest joy didn't come from the praise. He was excitedly preparing for an adventure he had been dreaming about for a long time, his very first solo flight to visit his grandparents in Charleston, South Carolina. Elijah shares a special bond with his grandparents. His grandfather, a former aircraft mechanic in the military, was the one who first sparked Elijah's love for airplanes. Every time they talked on the phone, his grandfather would tell him stories about repairing aircraft, how engines worked, and the times he spent in the vast hangars filled with machinery. His grandparents had always encouraged Elijah to follow his dreams. And this time, Elijah wanted to share his pride and achievements with them in person. Instead of having his parents accompany him, Elijah wanted to take this trip on his own as a reward for his hard work and as his first challenge to prove that he was growing up. That evening, during family dinner, Elijah confidently brought up the idea to his parents. "I want to fly to Charleston by myself to visit Grandma and Grandpa," he said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "I've done a lot of research. Other kids my age have flown alone, and I really want to try." Elijah's mom, Grace, hesitated. "Elijah, you're only 12. Flying alone isn't a simple matter." "But Mom, I've prepared so carefully," Elijah continued to persuade her. "The airline has a special service for kids flying alone. A flight attendant will take care of me from the moment I board until I land. This is my chance to be independent, Mom, and Grandma and Grandpa will be so happy to see me show up as a surprise." His dad, Daniel, sat quietly and thought before finally speaking up. "If you really want to do this, I'll talk to your mom. But you have to promise that you'll follow every instruction, and if anything happens, you must tell an adult immediately." Elijah nodded enthusiastically, his eyes full of hope. After some consideration, his mom finally agreed, though her concern was still evident. "All right, but you need to be careful. This isn't a game, you understand." The next morning, Elijah woke up with excitement. He quickly packed his backpack, his favorite book about airplanes, a small model plane gifted by his grandfather, some snacks, and a phone to stay in touch with his parents. He carefully picked out a neat outfit: a white polo shirt with little airplane designs, clean jeans, and a pair of bright blue sneakers, shoes he believed would bring him good luck. His mom added a special gift, a small necklace with a plain propeller pendant that she had worn when she was younger. "I'm giving this to you for good luck. Remember, I'm always here if you need me," she said, pulling Elijah into a hug. His dad, meanwhile, gave him a detailed rundown of what he needed to do at the airport. "Keep your papers and ticket with you at all times. Be polite to everyone, especially the flight attendants. And if anything comes up, don't hesitate to speak to them." Elijah beamed with confidence. "I promise I'll do exactly as you say, Dad." At the airport, Elijah felt like a real explorer. He observed the bustling crowds, the heavy luggage being wheeled around, and the airport staff moving quickly from one place to another. With his ticket hanging on a lanyard around his neck and his backpack slung over his shoulder, he felt like an experienced traveler. His parents escorted him to the check-in counter for unaccompanied minors. A friendly staff member took Elijah's ticket, attached a special tag to his backpack, and explained the process. "Elijah, a flight attendant will take you to your seat and look after you throughout the flight. Don't worry, you'll be in good hands." Elijah nodded and gave his parents a tight hug goodbye. "I'll be fine, Mom. This is going to be the best trip ever." As they watched their son walk through the security checkpoint, Elijah's mom couldn't hide her worry. But his dad placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and smiled. "He'll be fine. He's growing up. Elijah had no idea that this upcoming flight would not only test his independence but also turn into a journey that would change his life forever. Elijah has just begun his journey with pride and big dreams. But little does he know, the real challenge is waiting ahead. Will his confidence and courage be enough to overcome the obstacles he's about to face? Stay tuned for this unforgettable adventure in the next chapter. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to support our channel. Your support inspires us to bring you more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for being part of the journey. Atlanta Airport buzzed with activity on a busy morning. Flight information screens continuously updated with new numbers, travelers hurriedly wheeled their luggage past one another, and announcements echoed steadily across the terminal. With his backpack slung over his shoulders, Elijah stood by the special check-in counter for unaccompanied minors. His eyes sparkled with excitement, but he couldn't help feeling a slight twinge of nervousness as he watched the unfamiliar crowd rush around him. The check-in agent, Linda, a middle-aged woman with a warm, gentle smile, leaned down to speak to Elijah. "Elijah, are you excited?" she asked while double-checking his documents. Elijah nodded enthusiastically, trying his best to appear confident. "Yes, ma'am. This is my first time flying alone, but I've read a lot of books about airports and airplanes. I'm ready." Linda smiled. "That's great. We'll make sure you have a safe and memorable flight. Here's your special identification tag. Don't lose it, okay?" She attached a small tag to Elijah's backpack that read, "Unaccompanied minor." The tag would help airline staff easily recognize him and assist him when needed. Elijah looked at the tag, feeling like a very important passenger. "Don't worry," Linda continued. "Once you're on the plane, the flight attendants will take care of you. Just relax and enjoy your trip." She smiled reassuringly as she led Elijah through the security checkpoint. At the security gate, Elijah's parents stood a few steps behind, waving him goodbye. "Remember what I told you, Elijah. Don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. And make sure you call me as soon as you land," his mom reminded him one last time, her voice equal parts gentle and anxious. Elijah hugged his mom tightly, then turned to hug his dad. "I'll be fine, Mom. This is going to be the best trip ever." As Elijah walked through security, he glanced back at his parents. A tiny flutter of nerves crept into his chest, but he reminded himself that he could do this. This wasn't just any trip, it was a challenge he was determined to overcome to prove his independence. Elijah was guided to the waiting area for unaccompanied minors, where airline staff would monitor him until it was time to board. There, he saw other passengers, mostly adults, sitting and waiting for their flights. A few glanced at him kindly, perhaps noticing the tag on his backpack. He took a seat by the window, watching the enormous airplanes taxi across the runway. Elijah smiled as he felt his earlier nervousness melt away, replaced by excitement as he thought about his grandparents and the stories he'd share with them once he arrived. "I'll tell Grandpa all about the cockpit I'll get to see. Maybe I'll even get a picture," he thought to himself. But Elijah's excitement was quickly interrupted when he heard a cold voice. "Are you Elijah Brown?" Elijah looked up and saw a woman in a flight attendant uniform standing in front of him. It was Ms. Hensley, the head flight attendant for the flight. Her face was stern, and her eyes lacked any warmth. "Yes, ma'am, that's me," Elijah replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Ms. Hensley glanced at him, her eyes sweeping over the tag on Elijah's backpack and the neat outfit he was wearing. "Where's your paperwork?" she asked curtly. Elijah quickly handed over his boarding pass and the documents his mom had carefully prepared for him. But instead of offering him any reassurance or instructions, Ms. Hensley simply gave him a scrutinizing look and sighed. "Fine. Don't bother anyone on the flight," she said sharply. "Follow me." Elijah felt a little embarrassed by her attitude, but he didn't say anything. He quietly followed her as nearby passengers glanced at him curiously, making him feel even more uncomfortable. Ms. Hensley led Elijah to the boarding gate, where she exchanged a few quick words with the ground staff before escorting him onto the plane. On the way, she didn't say a word to him, walking briskly ahead as if she wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. When Elijah stepped onto the plane, he felt smaller than ever. He noticed the other flight attendants warmly greeting passengers as they boarded, but Ms. Hensley's icy demeanor remained unchanged as she glanced at him. She pointed to his assigned seat and said curtly, "Sit there. Make sure your backpack goes under the seat." Elijah nodded and quietly did as he was told. He placed his backpack under the seat, sat up straight, and pulled out his book, hoping to distract himself from the uneasy feeling in his chest. But before he could even open it, Ms. Hensley returned and said in a firm tone, "Sit up straight, and don't cause any trouble." Elijah froze, feeling his cheeks flush as a few passengers nearby turned to look. He couldn't understand why she was treating him this way. What did I do wrong, he wondered, his heart sinking with confusion and disappointment. As more passengers boarded the plane, Elijah noticed that Ms. Hensley smiled and chatted warmly with them, especially the adults. She even joked with one man about the oversized hat he was wearing. But every time she passed by Elijah's row, her face would turn cold, and she avoided looking at him, almost as if she didn't want to acknowledge his presence. Elijah tried his best not to pay attention, telling himself, maybe she's just tired or doesn't like kids, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The flight he had looked forward to for so long was no longer bringing him the joy he had imagined. When the cabin doors closed and the engines roared to life, Elijah turned to look out the window, trying to calm himself. He thought about his grandparents and his parents' encouraging words. He reminded himself that all he had to do was get through the flight, and everything would be fine. But little did Elijah know, this was only the beginning of a journey filled with challenges he never could have anticipated. Elijah tried to stay calm as the plane began taxiing down the runway. The low rumble of the engines reverberated through the cabin, and he could feel the immense power of the giant aircraft he had always admired. Looking out the window, he watched as the ground slowly shrank away when the plane lifted off, and for a brief moment, all of his worries seemed to disappear. "I'm flying," Elijah thought to himself, his heart filled with excitement. But his joy didn't last long. Just as he pulled a small model airplane from his backpack to play with, a cold voice sounded beside him. "What are you doing?" Startled, Elijah looked up. It was Ms. Hensley. She stood in the aisle, arms crossed, staring down at him with a displeased expression. "I'm just playing with my airplane model," Elijah answered softly, trying to keep any nervousness out of his voice. But Ms. Hensley wasn't pleased. "Put it away. And sit properly. This isn't the place for toys, understand," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Elijah felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. He didn't understand why she was speaking to him like that when he was just sitting quietly and not bothering anyone. Some of the passengers glanced at him, a few raising their eyebrows in surprise, but no one said anything. Hastily, Elijah put the model back into his backpack and sat up straight as she instructed. He felt as though he had just been scolded for something he didn't even do wrong. Throughout the flight, Ms. Hensley continued to show her displeasure toward Elijah. As she walked past his row to serve other passengers, the smile she wore for them would vanish the moment her eyes landed on him. She smiled at an older man and even joked with him about his oversized hat. "That hat might need its own ticket," she said, making the man and the passengers nearby laugh. But when she approached Elijah's row, her smile disappeared completely. Elijah tried to ignore it, but he couldn't help feeling like he was being treated as if he were a nuisance. He didn't dare ask her for anything, not even when he needed a drink of water. Instead, he kept his head down, focusing on his book, trying his best not to attract any attention. When the plane began to shake lightly due to turbulence, Elijah grew nervous. He had never experienced this sensation before, and his heart raced as the shaking intensified. Other passengers began whispering to each other, and a few tightened their seatbelts. Elijah looked around, wanting to ask Ms. Hensley if everything was okay, but she was nowhere to be seen. Other flight attendants moved through the cabin, reassuring passengers, but Ms. Hensley seemed to deliberately avoid his row. After a few minutes, the plane stabilized. Elijah let out a quiet sigh of relief, but a small knot of fear had taken root in his stomach. He wasn't just worried about the flight anymore, he was also afraid of having to interact with Ms. Hensley again. The tension reached its peak as the plane prepared to land. Ms. Hensley returned to Elijah's seat to check if his seatbelt was fastened correctly. Elijah had followed every instruction, but she still found a reason to criticize him. "Your seatbelt isn't on properly. Fix it," she snapped, even though Elijah's seatbelt was secured correctly. Embarrassed and exhausted, Elijah bent down to adjust the seatbelt to her liking. But even after he finished, Ms. Hensley shook her head and sighed in frustration. "What a nuisance." Her words stung, and Elijah's eyes burned with tears. He turned to look out the window, trying to hide his emotions. He couldn't understand why she seemed to dislike him so much. He had done everything his parents and the airline staff had instructed him to do. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is she treating me like this, he thought, his heart heavy with confusion and hurt. As the plane landed and taxied toward the gate, passengers began standing up to gather their belongings. Elijah stayed seated, waiting for his turn as instructed, but instead of being escorted off the plane by a flight attendant as promised, Ms. Hensley appeared in front of him again, her face colder than ever. Get off the plane right now. I've already notified the airport staff. We can't deal with you any longer. Elijah's mouth fell open in shock at her words. But what did I do wrong, he asked, his voice trembling. You've been too much trouble and haven't followed the rules, Ms. Hensley replied, not bothering to explain further. Elijah felt like his heart was being crushed. In front of the stunned passengers, Ms. Hensley led him off the plane, leaving behind curious and pitying glances from the other travelers. At the airport gate, Elijah sat on a bench, clutching his backpack tightly, trying to hold back tears. He felt like he had been punished for something he didn't even do. The airport staff tried to comfort him, but nothing could ease the pain he felt in that moment. When Elijah's parents received a call from the airline, they rushed to the airport. Grace knelt down in front of her son, gently wiping the tears from his cheeks. What happened? Elijah. Why are you here? I thought you'd be in Charleston by now. Elijah, his voice choked with emotion, began to explain everything. The flight attendant. She said I was causing trouble, but I didn't do anything wrong, Mom. I just sat there and followed all the rules. Daniel clenched his fist tightly, his face flushed with anger. Grace turned to the airport staff, her voice shaking with fury. I need to speak to someone in charge immediately. Why was my son treated this way? Elijah looked at his mother, feeling both hurt and afraid. He couldn't understand why the flight he had been so excited about had turned into such a nightmare. What Elijah didn't know was that this was just the beginning. What was supposed to be a joyful and exciting first flight turned into a nightmare for the young boy. Treated unfairly, isolated, and hurt, he now faces emotions he's never experienced before. Will his strength and courage be enough to help him overcome this challenge? Stay tuned to discover what happens next in this deeply emotional journey. If this story resonates with you, please hit the subscribe button and share it to support our channel. Your support inspires us to continue sharing meaningful stories like this one. Mr. Daniel and Mrs. Grace wasted no time. After comforting Elijah, they headed straight to the airline's customer service desk. The young woman working there looked flustered as she noticed Mrs. Grace's anger and quickly called for a manager. A short while later, Mr. Carter, a senior airline manager, arrived. He was a middle-aged man with a serious but calm demeanor. He shook hands with Grace and Daniel, then bent down to speak to Elijah, who was still clutching his backpack tightly and staring at the ground. Elijah. Are you okay? Can you tell me what happened? Mr. Carter asked gently. Elijah looked up, his eyes still slightly red. He began recounting the events, starting from when he boarded the plane, describing how Ms. Hensley had been rude and dismissive toward him, and finally how she forced him off the flight. Mrs. Grace interrupted, her voice full of anger. My son is just a child. He did nothing wrong. She had no right to kick him off the plane without a valid reason. This is blatant discrimination. Mr. Daniel, though trying to remain composed, couldn't hide the frustration in his voice. We trusted the airline to keep our son safe. Instead, you allowed him to be treated like this? Why? Mr. Carter listened carefully, nodding as he absorbed their words, but he didn't respond immediately. Once Elijah finished telling his story, Mr. Carter let out a sigh, looked at the family, and said, I am deeply sorry for what happened. This is not the way we want to treat our customers, especially a child. I promise to investigate this matter immediately and provide you with an explanation as soon as possible. Mr. Carter returned to his office without delay. He instructed the airline's team to review all reports related to Elijah's flight, paying particular attention to Ms. Hensley's behavior. It didn't take long for his team to present footage from the plane's onboard security cameras, which captured the entire incident. The footage clearly showed how Ms. Hensley treated Elijah, the disdainful glances, the harsh tone, and the unnecessary rude comments. None of it aligned with how a flight attendant should behave toward any passenger, let alone a child. As they dug deeper, the investigation uncovered something even more troubling. This wasn't the first time Ms. Hensley had been the subject of complaints. Several passengers, particularly unaccompanied minors, had previously reported her for being unfriendly or unfair, However, those complaints had been dismissed in the past due to a lack of concrete evidence. "We cannot let this continue," Mr. Carter said firmly, his expression resolute. "Behavior like this is absolutely unacceptable. We need to take responsibility. Form of discrimination or unprofessional behavior from our staff. The flight attendant involved has been temporarily suspended pending an investigation, and appropriate actions will be taken. We are committed to creating a safe and welcoming environment for all passengers, especially children." The statement quickly went viral on social media, with many people expressing their support for Elijah. "It's horrifying that a child had to go through this," one Twitter user wrote. "But I admire Elijah's bravery. Not everyone would have the courage to speak up." Other families began sharing similar stories of bad experiences while flying, particularly involving children traveling alone. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter personally visited Elijah and his family at their home in Atlanta. He brought with him a heartfelt apology and a special offer. "Elijah, we've arranged another flight for you to visit your grandparents. This time, I promise you'll be taken care of in the best way possible," he said. "In addition, we'd like to invite you to the cockpit so you can meet the captain. It's a small way for us to make up for what you went through." Elijah's eyes lit up. Although he still felt a bit nervous, his passion for airplanes took over. He turned to his mom and asked softly, "Can I try again, Mom?" "I'm not scared this time," Mrs. Gray smiled, gently patting his shoulder. "Of course, sweetheart. You've been so brave." The next day, Elijah was greeted at the airport by an entirely new team, who were all well aware of his story. As he boarded the plane, he was warmly welcomed by the captain, who bent down to shake his hand and said, "We're so proud of your bravery, Elijah. Today is going to be a great day." Elijah was invited into the cockpit before takeoff. The captain explained the various buttons and controls and even let him press the button to turn on the seatbelt sign. When Elijah returned to his seat, he noticed the passengers around him smiling at him. A few even whispered, "That kid is so brave." Elijah smiled back. This time he felt confident and welcomed. When the plane landed in Charleston, Elijah's grandparents were already waiting for him at the arrival's gate. He ran into their arms, feeling all of his worries melt away. "I flew all by myself, Grandma and Grandpa. And I even got to go inside the cockpit," he exclaimed, his eyes sparkling with joy. His grandmother hugged him tightly and whispered, "You are such a brave young man, Elijah. We're so proud of you." What Elijah didn't realize was that his story had spread far beyond that one flight, creating a ripple effect of change not just within the airline, but also in the wider community. And this was just the beginning. When everything seemed to have fallen apart, the love and support from family and those around him reignited hope for the young boy. But will the airline truly take responsibility for their mistakes? And can Elijah fully regain his confidence to continue his journey? This story is far from over, and it's filled with even more surprises. Stay tuned to discover how it all unfolds. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to support our channel, because your encouragement is what inspires us to bring you even more meaningful stories like this one. Elijah sat on his grandparents' porch the next afternoon, feeling a sense of relief after a journey that had brought more emotions than he had ever expected. His grandfather, a former aircraft mechanic, listened intently as Elijah recounted the entire story, his eyes wide with interest. "You did very well, my boy," his grandfather said, nodding with pride. "I've always said that being a pilot isn't just about knowing how airplanes work, it's about having the courage to face tough challenges. And you proved that, Elijah." His grandmother added, "We're not going to let this go unnoticed. What you've done, standing up and persevering, will help others like you, Elijah. We're so proud of you." Elijah smiled, though a trace of doubt lingered. "But why did she hate me, Grandma? I didn't do anything wrong." His grandmother looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes, Elijah, people carry prejudices or anger within themselves, and they take it out on others. It's not your fault. But standing up for fairness is important. It doesn't just help you, it helps others who might face the same treatment." Elijah was quiet for a moment, reflecting. "I just hope no one else ever has to feel the way I felt on that plane," he said softly. While Elijah enjoyed the rest of his days with his grandparents, his story began spreading across various media platforms. When the airline publicly apologized to Elijah's family on social media, their post was quickly shared thousands of times. People following the story expressed not only sympathy for Elijah but also admiration for his bravery in standing up and refusing to let the injustice go unnoticed. "This boy is incredible. We need more people like Elijah in this world, one Facebook user commented. Next time I fly, I'm going to think about Elijah and make sure no one is treated unfairly, another person tweeted. Families who had experienced similar situations, particularly families of color, began sharing their own stories. One mother wrote, "My daughter was treated the same way on a flight once. But at the time, we didn't have evidence and we didn't know what to do. I'm so grateful to Elijah's family for speaking up." The airline didn't stop at apologizing. Faced with mounting criticism, they were forced to take stronger action. Mr. Carter held a press conference, pledging to improve their services and retrain the entire flight crew to ensure that discriminatory or unprofessional behavior would never happen again. "We're not just apologizing to Elijah's family," Mr. Carter stated during the press conference. "We are committed to change. This is not just about one individual, it's a systemic issue that needs to be addressed thoroughly." Additionally, the airline announced that Ms. Hensley had been suspended from duty and that a deeper investigation was being launched. Meanwhile, some passengers who had been on Elijah's flight began speaking out. An elderly woman, Mrs. Margaret Green, posted on Facebook, "I was sitting near the boy Elijah that day. He was so polite, quietly reading his book throughout the flight. But I couldn't believe the way the flight attendant treated him. When she forced him off the plane, it was so unfair, but I didn't say anything. I regret staying silent. Elijah, you are a young hero. You did what I didn't have the courage to do." Mrs. Green's post quickly gained thousands of shares, fueling even more outrage over Ms. Hensley's behavior. One day, while Elijah was playing in his grandparents' yard, his mom called with some surprising news. "Elijah, have you seen the news?" Grace asked. "Your story has been featured in the papers and even on television." Elijah's eyes widened in shock. "Really, Mom? But why is it such a big deal?" "Don't you see how important what you did is?" his mom said with a smile over the phone. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for every child who has been or could be treated unfairly." A moment later, Grace continued, "And that's not all. The airline called me back. They want to invite you to visit their pilot training center when you're back in Atlanta." Elijah's heart raced with excitement. "I'll get to see how they really fly the planes, Mom." "That's right. And who knows? Maybe this will be the start of making your dream of becoming a pilot come true." Meanwhile, Ms. Hensley, who once thought she could hide her misconduct forever, was facing the consequences of her actions. The airline's internal investigation uncovered that she had a history of discriminatory and unprofessional behavior in the past. The airline made the decision to terminate her employment and alerted other airlines to ensure she wouldn't continue working in the industry without being held accountable for her actions. Ms. Hensley left the airline's office feeling both defeated and ashamed. She realized that her treatment of Elijah hadn't just hurt a child, it had shattered the trust of thousands of people in her and her profession. When Elijah returned to Atlanta, he was warmly welcomed by his family, friends, and the entire community. The airline organized a small ceremony at their pilot training center to honor him. Elijah was given the chance to experience a flight simulator, learning how to operate a virtual plane, and was even awarded an honorary certificate recognizing him as a junior Colorado pilot. The airline's captain, who personally guided Elijah during the visit, said, "Elijah, you have the potential to become an incredible pilot. I hope one day I'll get to fly alongside you on a real flight." Elijah smiled, his eyes shining with hope for the future. He realized that although this journey began with challenges and pain, it had given him the opportunity to grow, learn, and inspire others. That evening, as he sat by his window, gazing at the starry sky, Elijah whispered to himself, "One day I'll fly not just in the sky, but past every obstacle in my way." Elijah's story didn't end here. It became a source of inspiration for countless others, and he knew that his journey to achieve his dream had only just begun. This story comes to a close, but the journey of courage, justice, and dreams lives on. Elijah proved that no matter how small, strength and determination can create monumental change, not just for oneself, but for an entire community. This isn't just a story about a flight. It's a reminder that we all have the power to do extraordinary things when we stand up for what's right. If this story has inspired you, please hit the subscribe button to support our channel. Your encouragement is the driving force that allows us to bring you more heartwarming and impactful stories. Don't forget to share this story to spread its meaningful message to others. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next story.